Tomorrow, 4 human beings will leave Earth and head for the far side of the moon. From here, from a safe distance, it will look like exactly what we have been waiting half a century to see. It will look like progress. It will look like confidence restored. It will look like the old story beginning again. And people will feel that. They should. Because this is not a trivial mission. It is not routine. For more than 50 years, no human being has traveled this far from Earth. Entire generations have grown up on a planet where the moon belonged not to the present, but to history, grainy photographs, museum voices, and the afterglow of Apollo. So when Artemis rises, the footage will feel larger than a launch. It will feel like a thread cut in 1972 is finally being tied back together. But the moon does not return history gently. That is the sentence missing from almost every version of this story. Because beneath the applause, beneath the nostalgia, beneath the familiar language of courage and human ambition, there is a quieter truth and a much harder one. The moon is not waiting for us. It is not a harbour. It is not a frontier that remembers us kindly. And it is not passive. It is one of the most hostile environments human beings have ever chosen to enter. Its dust does not stay outside. Its radiation does not need to be seen to matter. Its surface punishes every material we bring there. And even when nothing dramatic appears to be happening, the environment is already working against you. That is what makes this mission different from the story people want to tell about it. Stay with me, because Artemis is not just asking whether we can go back to the moon. It is asking whether the moon will let us function there long enough for return to mean anything at all. That is a heavier question. And once you hear it clearly, the whole emotional shape of the mission begins to change. Because the moon has spent decades being discussed in softened language, a grey rock, a silent object, a dead world, a place that feels difficult but fundamentally known. We talk about going back as if the main barriers were distance, money, and political will, as if the moon were simply waiting for better hardware and a more determined century. But distance was never the whole problem. The closer you get to the moon, the less protected you are by every system Earth has quietly provided your entire life. The atmosphere, the magnetic field, the filtered light, the softened temperature, the simple fact that this planet keeps danger from arriving cleanly. On the moon, almost none of that protection remains. Radiation arrives with very little mercy. Dust turns from scenery into contamination. Temperature stops being weather and becomes punishment. Even the ground itself may not be as passive as we once assumed. So yes, the world will celebrate this mission. It should. But celebration is only the surface emotion. Underneath it is a much more important correction. Apollo proved that human beings could survive a brief visit under extraordinary conditions. It did not prove the moon was compatible with long-term human presence. It did not prove lungs could tolerate the dust, or bodies could adapt to 1/6 gravity, or machinery could survive year after year of thermal cycling, darkness, abrasion, and exposure. Apollo proved access. It never proved compatibility. And that is why Artemis matters so much. Not because it lets us repeat a glorious old moment, but because it begins the first honest test of a much more uncomfortable idea. Not whether we can reach the moon, whether we can stay there without the environment slowly unmaking everything we bring with us. Apollo gave us one of the most powerful illusions in the history of exploration. It gave us success so visually complete, so symbolically overwhelming, that we quietly allowed it to answer a larger question than it ever really did. Human beings landed on the moon. They walked on it. They worked on it. They collected samples, planted instruments, drove vehicles across its surface, and came home. The achievement was real. The courage was real. The capability was real. But somewhere in the decades that followed, a subtle distortion entered the story. We began to treat a brief victory as if it were proof of long-term compatibility. That is the distinction we need to hold on to now, because almost everything depends on it. Apollo proved that under extremely narrow conditions, with extraordinary engineering, enormous political urgency, tightly constrained timelines, and missions measured in days, human beings could survive a short visit to the moon. That is what it proved, and that alone remains one of the greatest accomplishments our species has ever produced. But a short visit is not the same thing as habitation. A few days is not the same thing as a season. A controlled landing is not the same thing as an operating outpost. A mission designed to get there and come back alive is not the same thing as an environment in which biology, machinery, and psychology can remain stable over time. Those are not poetic differences, they are structural ones, because everything about Apollo was built around brevity. The crews did not stay long enough for slow problems to become real problems. They did not live through repeated exposure cycles. They did not remain on the surface long enough for dust contamination to become cumulative in the way it would for a permanent habitat. They did not face month after month of elevated radiation. They did not test what happens to the human body after weeks in lunar gravity, because no one was there for weeks. They did not discover whether equipment could endure long after the first mission ended, because Apollo hardware was never meant to survive that kind of duration in the first place. In other words, Apollo did not fail to answer the long-term question. It was never designed to answer it, and that matters because modern conversation often treats Apollo as if it closed the case. As if the argument went like this: we went there once, therefore we know what the moon is. We survived there once, therefore we know humans can handle it. We planted flags and returned home, therefore the hard part is behind us. But in reality, Apollo may have done something more complicated than that. It may have proven just enough to make the moon feel familiar, while leaving the deepest survival questions almost untouched. That is what makes the present moment so important. Artemis is arriving after 50 years of accumulated science, and that science has not made the moon look simpler. It has made it look harsher, stranger, and less forgiving than the public memory of Apollo tends to suggest. The image we inherited was one of competence and triumph. The picture that followed was one of unfinished biological, geological, and engineering uncertainty. And to be fair, Apollo itself contained warnings. The dust got into the cabin, the suits showed abrasion, astronauts reported irritation. The environment already pushed back in small, revealing ways. But those warnings were embedded inside a larger historical miracle, and the miracle understandably took center stage. When a civilization lands on another world for the first time, it does not immediately focus on the fine print. It remembers the footprint, the horizon, the voice over the radio. It remembers that we made it. What it does not always remember is how little time we actually spent there. The longest any Apollo crew remained on the lunar surface was only a matter of days, not weeks, not months, not long enough for chronic exposure to become visible in a meaningful medical sense, not long enough for structural fatigue to reveal the true weakness of systems meant to function over repeated cycles, not long enough for the moon to show us what it does, not during arrival, but during residence. And residence is the real threshold, because a place can allow you to visit without allowing you to stay. A diver can survive a brief descent into deep water with the right equipment. That does not make the ocean floor habitable. A climber can reach a summit for a short period under controlled conditions. That does not mean the summit can support ordinary life. The fact that humans can endure a few days inside an environment tells you something important, but also something dangerously incomplete. It tells you the environment is survivable in bursts. It does not tell you it is sustainable. That is the category mistake Apollo accidentally encouraged. It did not prove the moon was a future home. It proved that with enough precision, enough support, and enough speed, we could touch a world fundamentally hostile to us and leave before its deeper pressures had time to fully accumulate. So, when Artemis is described as a return, that description is emotionally true, but scientifically, it is only partially true. We are returning geographically. We are not returning biologically. We are not returning with complete knowledge. We are not stepping back into a solved environment. We are moving forward into a question that Apollo opened but never settled. Can human systems hold together there for longer than a few days? Can lungs tolerate the dust? Can materials survive the cycles? Can the body adapt to reduced gravity? Can radiation exposure be managed not briefly, but continuously? Can a habitat remain intact in an environment that erodes everything slowly, patiently, and without pause? Apollo did not tell us. Apollo told us something both magnificent and limited, that the moon can be visited. Artemis begins the far more difficult test of whether it can be lived with. And once you understand that difference, the moon changes shape again. It stops looking like a place we already conquered and starts looking like a place we only touched long enough to misunderstand, which means the next question is no longer about distance or symbolism. It is about the environment itself. And the first part of that environment, the part that seems harmless until you examine it closely, is the ground beneath your feet. The first mistake is in the word itself. We call it dust, and that immediately makes it sound familiar. Dust belongs to attics, bookshelves, old windows, abandoned rooms. Dust is what settles quietly on things that have been left alone. It is light, forgettable, domestic, something you wipe away with a cloth and move on from. Lunar dust is nothing like that. What covers the surface of the moon is not the soft, rounded powder the word suggests. It is regolith, a material formed in an environment so violent and so stripped of every softening process that the result is almost the opposite of soil. On Earth, rock is broken down by wind, rain, rivers, heat, ice, chemistry, and life. Edges are worn down, surfaces are rounded. Time acts like a patient sculptor, taking sharpness out of the world. But on the moon, that sculptor does not exist. There is no atmosphere, no rain, no flowing water, no weather, no biology, no slow cycle that takes broken fragments and smooths them into something safer. So the surface remains what billions of years of impacts made it. Shattered, angular, abrasive, and chemically unfinished. That difference matters more than it first appears. Because once you understand what lunar dust physically is, it stops being background scenery and becomes the first serious survival problem. Under a microscope, the particles do not resemble sand. They resemble broken glass, jagged edges, fractured surfaces, sharp mineral fragments small enough to cling to fabric, work their way into seals, scratch transparent materials, and in the worst case, travel deep into the human respiratory system. And unlike the dust we know on Earth, this material has spent immense spans of time exposed directly to vacuum, radiation, and micrometeorite bombardment. It is not only sharp, it is reactive. That is where the danger begins to separate into two paths at once. The first path is biological, the second is mechanical, and the moon forces you to deal with both simultaneously. Start with the body. A particle does not need to be large to be dangerous. In many cases, the opposite is true. The smaller it is, the deeper it can go. Lunar dust includes particles fine enough to bypass many of the body's natural defenses, slipping past the upper airway and reaching the most delicate regions of the lungs. There, the problem is no longer just irritation, it becomes persistence, a sharp, chemically aggressive material lodged where the body is least prepared to remove it efficiently. On Earth, we already understand the danger of fine silica-rich particles in industrial environments. We know what chronic inhalation can do over time. What makes the moon more troubling is that the lunar version may be even more reactive than the terrestrial substances we use as analogues in laboratories. It is dust-shaped, not by weather, but by impact physics and long exposure to open space. And the deeply uncomfortable truth is that no human being has ever been exposed to it for long enough to tell us what the full biological cost really is. Apollo gave us the warning, but not the duration. Astronauts came back into the lunar module with dust on their suits, on their gloves, on their equipment, on every surface that had touched the ground outside. Once inside, that dust did what fine particles always do in confined spaces. It did not stay politely where it landed. It lifted, it circulated, it was breathed. Several astronauts reported eye irritation, throat irritation, sneezing, symptoms that sounded almost mundane until you realize how little exposure it took to produce them. That was after hours, not weeks, not months, hours. So now imagine replacing a short Apollo excursion with a sustained surface campaign. Imagine repeated EVAs, repeated re-entry into a habitat, repeated accumulation, not one contamination event, but a contamination cycle. Each excursion adds a little more. Each return carries a little more inward. Each surface operation slowly thickens the background burden inside the only sheltered environment human beings have. And there is no perfect reset. That is what makes lunar dust so dangerous conceptually. It is not just an external hazard, it is a migration hazard. The boundary between outside and inside does not cleanly hold against it. The dust follows you home. Now, follow the second path, the mechanical one, and the picture becomes just as severe. Because the same qualities that make lunar dust dangerous to tissue make it dangerous to systems. Sharp particles do not merely coat machinery, they abrade it. They work into moving joints, seals, hinges, connectors, bearings, zippers, visors, filters, and contact surfaces. They turn friction into wear and wear into failure. Apollo's suits already showed signs of abrasion after very limited surface exposure. Not catastrophic failure, but something in some ways more alarming: steady degradation. The kind that accumulates quietly across every mission task until an essential component no longer behaves the way it did at the beginning. That is the engineering nightmare. Not a dramatic explosion, not a cinematic collapse, a seal that closes a little less perfectly, a joint that moves a little less smoothly, a visor that scatters a little more light, a mechanism that becomes gritty, then unreliable, then mission-limiting. And because lunar dust is electrostatically clingy, removal is not simple. It adheres to surfaces stubbornly. It resists cleaning. It enters fabrics. It bonds itself to the very materials meant to protect the astronaut from the outside environment. In an ordinary setting, maintenance solves this kind of problem. On the Moon, maintenance is happening inside the same contaminated volume you are trying to keep habitable. The act of cleaning can become another act of redistribution. That is why it is a mistake to treat dust as a nuisance. A nuisance is annoying but secondary. Lunar dust is not secondary. It sits at the intersection of biology, operations, and hardware lifespan. It threatens lungs. It threatens habitats. It threatens suits. It threatens the long-term reliability of every system that has to move, close, seal, rotate, or remain transparent. And, because it accumulates gradually, it is exactly the kind of hazard public imagination tends to underestimate. People picture danger as something sudden. The Moon's dust teaches the opposite lesson. Some environments do not kill by shock. They kill by infiltration. That may be the most unsettling part of all. Because when people imagine survival on another world, they tend to think first of the spectacular threats: radiation, explosions, vacuum, impact. They imagine the obvious enemies. But the Moon's first line of resistance may be something quieter than that: a grey powder underfoot, a surface material so ordinary-looking from a distance that it barely registers as threatening at all. And yet it may be the thing that follows every astronaut back inside, settles into every system, scratches every interface, irritates every airway, and slowly teaches us that the Moon does not need dramatic violence to make itself hostile. It only needs time. And that is precisely why dust becomes the first true dividing line between a visit and a settlement. A short mission can survive contamination. A long mission has to live with it. A brief landing can tolerate some abrasion. A permanent outpost has to prevent abrasion from becoming cumulative system decay. A few hours of exposure can be logged, monitored, and endured. But once humans begin staying longer, the question changes completely. Not can we survive touching the surface. Can we survive breathing around it, sealing against it, working through it, and bringing it back inside again and again, without letting it slowly compromise the entire architecture of life on the Moon? That is the real significance of lunar dust. It is not scenery, it is not texture, it is not atmosphere. It is the Moon in particulate form, finding its way into every fragile human boundary. And if the ground itself is already this hostile, then what waits above that ground is worse, because up there, the thing trying to kill you is not even visible. If lunar dust is the first danger you can carry back inside with you, radiation is the danger that never waits for permission. You cannot brush it off. You cannot seal it in a bag. You cannot look down and see where it has landed. It does not arrive as a dramatic object crossing the sky. It arrives invisibly, continuously, as part of the background condition of being there at all. And that is what makes the Moon's radiation environment so difficult to think about clearly. People tend to imagine radiation as an event, a spike, a crisis, something unusual that happens when conditions go wrong. But on the Moon, the more unsettling truth is that even when nothing appears to be happening, the danger is already present. Because what protects you on Earth is so constant, so complete, and so easy to ignore that it has become psychologically invisible. The atmosphere above your head is not empty space. It is shielding. The magnetic field surrounding the planet is not an abstract scientific feature. It is defense. Every day of your life, high-energy particles are being diverted, absorbed, scattered, or slowed before they reach your body. Cosmic rays, solar particles, energetic radiation from deep space, and from our own star are being managed by planetary systems you did not build and never had to think about. On the Moon, most of that protection is gone. There is no thick atmosphere to absorb incoming radiation, no global magnetic shield wrapping the surface in a dependable cocoon, no planetary buffer softening the full force of space before it arrives. The result is not a slightly harsher version of Earth. It is a fundamentally different exposure condition. A human being on the moon is not standing on protected ground. A human being on the moon is standing in open space with only whatever shielding happens to be built into the suit, the rover, or the habitat. And even on a quiet day, that is already dangerous. That point matters because the baseline itself is not safe. The ordinary background radiation environment on the moon is not some tolerable neutral state occasionally interrupted by rare bursts of extreme weather. The baseline is already elevated enough to force a confrontation with long-term biological risk, even when the sun is calm, even when no alarms are sounding, even when the mission is proceeding exactly as planned. The body is still being exposed to a stream of ionizing radiation far beyond what life on Earth evolved to tolerate. That exposure is not theatrical. It does not announce itself. You do not feel it when it happens. No pain, no immediate warning, no obvious sensory clue. But at the cellular level, it is not passive. Radiation is damage written small. High-energy particles pass through tissue and strip electrons from atoms along the way. Chemical bonds break, DNA is hit, cellular repair systems activate. Most of the time, the body repairs at least some of that damage. But repair is not the same thing as reversal, and it is certainly not perfection. Over time, error accumulates, risk accumulates. The body keeps a record, even when the mind has no perception of the event. That is what makes radiation psychologically difficult to respect. It is easier to fear a sharp object than an invisible process. Easier to imagine danger when it cuts or burns than when it quietly alters the integrity of living tissue, one microscopic interaction at a time. And on the moon, that process is not occasional, it is daily. This is where the comforting logic of short missions begins to break down. A brief exposure can be managed, a controlled transit can be justified. But the moment the goal shifts toward repeated missions, extended stays, permanent infrastructure, and long-duration habitation, the arithmetic changes. The question is no longer whether astronauts can pass through a dangerous environment for a short time. The question is whether human biology can endure a cumulative exposure pattern that never fully turns off, not for hours, not for a symbolic landing window, but for weeks, months, perhaps eventually longer. And that is only the baseline, because the moon does not merely expose you to constant radiation, it also leaves you vulnerable to sudden escalation. This is where the second layer of the problem becomes more frightening than the first. Space is not a quiet vacuum with a steady and predictable radiation field. It is connected to a star, and stars do not behave gently just because we have decided to visit nearby worlds. The sun is dynamic, unstable, and magnetically violent. Most of the time, that violence unfolds at a distance we can ignore from the safety of Earth's shielded surface. But on the moon, solar activity stops being a spectacular image on a monitor and becomes an operational threat with a real-time countdown attached to it. A solar particle event can take an already dangerous background environment and turn it into an acute survival emergency, not a vague future cancer risk, not an abstract statistical concern, an immediate, mission-shaping hazard. This is the part most public narratives flatten too quickly. They acknowledge radiation in the abstract, then move on as if it was simply one problem on a checklist. But the real terror of solar storm risk is not just the dose, it is the warning window. Because if a major event begins while an astronaut is outside, the moon offers no forgiving margin, no breathable atmosphere, no partial environmental shelter, no sky that softens impact. The only real response is to get behind shielding, and to do it fast enough that the physics of the event do not outrun the mobility of the astronaut. That means the danger is not only in the storm itself, it is in distance, in timing, in where the crew happens to be when the sun changes its mind. An EVA on the moon is never just a task. It is a wager against invisible conditions that can become lethal faster than comfort allows us to imagine. And this is where the emotional story of exploration begins to invert again. Because from a distance, the moon looks calm, silent, stable, almost patient. But radiation reveals something essential about its true nature. The moon is not dangerous because it is dramatic. It is dangerous because it removes the systems that normally stand between life and the raw behavior of the universe. The surface is hostile not because it attacks actively, but because it refuses to protect. It lets space arrive unfiltered. That distinction changes everything. It means survival is not merely a matter of bravery or technical competence. It becomes a matter of managing exposure in a place where the environment is fundamentally indifferent to tissue, to mission schedules, to engineering optimism, to the comforting human habit of assuming that danger will announce itself before it becomes fatal. On the moon, the deadliest processes can already be underway while everything still appears calm. And there is one more reason this matters so deeply. Radiation is not isolated from the other hazards we have already begun to name. It does not wait politely while you solve the dust problem. It does not pause while a habitat seal is being checked, while equipment is being repaired, while a crew member is already under physiological stress from reduced gravity, isolation, exhaustion, or contamination. It acts on top of everything else. It compounds. It turns the moon from a collection of separate threats into a single layered environment in which every system must function under invisible pressure all the time. That is why radiation becomes the second great dividing line between a visit and a future. A short mission can endure exposure. A long mission has to absorb it. A brief landing can accept elevated risk for a limited window. A permanent presence has to build an entire architecture of shielding, timing, shelter, mobility, and biological tolerance around the fact that the sky itself is not neutral. And even then, none of it becomes truly safe. Only less exposed, only more managed, only marginally more survivable than before. That is the reality hidden beneath the silence. The moon does not need storms, winds, or oceans to remind you that you do not belong there. It has a more efficient method. It simply removes the shield and lets the universe do the rest. And if that invisible pressure is already enough to threaten the body from above, then the next question is, what happens when the moon begins wearing down the machines as steadily as it wears down the people inside them? If radiation is the invisible pressure that never stops touching the body, the thermal environment of the moon is what begins touching everything we build. And unlike the dramatic dangers people instinctively imagine, this one does not usually arrive as a single catastrophic moment. It arrives as repetition. Heat, then cold. Expansion, then contraction. Exposure, then darkness. Again and again, on a cycle so extreme that the moon stops feeling like a place and starts feeling like a test chamber. No Earth-built system was ever naturally meant to endure for long. That is the first thing the word temperature fails to capture. On Earth, temperature is something we experience through weather. A hot afternoon, a freezing night, a seasonal change. Even in the harshest deserts or polar regions, those changes are moderated by atmosphere, by air movement, by moisture, by clouds, by the simple fact that our planet is wrapped in systems that soften the transition between one state and another. The moon has no such softness, no air to distribute heat, no weather to even things out, no atmospheric blanket to hold warmth in or keep extremes from sharpening into something brutal. So when sunlight strikes the lunar surface, it does so directly, unfiltered, relentless. And when darkness arrives, it is not the darkness of an Earth night. It is the absence of solar input on an airless world that cannot keep its heat. The result is not just a harsh environment. It is a material punishment cycle. At lunar noon, sunlit surfaces can climb to temperatures that push far beyond what ordinary terrestrial systems encounter in normal service life. Then, as the long lunar night takes over, those same surfaces plunge into deep cold, so severe that the word freezing almost feels too gentle to describe it. Between those two states lies an enormous thermal swing, and that swing matters because materials do not experience temperature passively, they respond to it physically. Metals expand. Composites shift. Seals tighten, loosen, harden, or fatigue. Joints that once aligned precisely begin to experience microscopic differences in fit. Interfaces between different materials start to suffer from the fact that they do not all expand and contract at the same rate. That is where the real damage begins. Not because one hot day destroys a machine, and not because one cold night snaps it in half, but because repeated cycling turns stability into wear. A cable that functioned perfectly at deployment is stressed a little more each cycle. A seal that held pressure at the start of the mission loses a little margin. A mechanical joint becomes a little less smooth. A structural element develops tiny internal stresses that no camera can easily see, but which do not disappear just because the system continues operating. This is how the moon attacks hardware. Not with spectacle, But with persistence, it degrades confidence, and the longer a system is meant to remain there, the more dangerous that becomes. Apollo hardware did not have to prove it could survive year after year. It had to last long enough for the mission profile that existed. Artemis, and anything beyond Artemis, is moving toward a completely different standard. Habitats, power systems, rovers, storage units, landing infrastructure, extraction equipment, thermal protection layers, communication nodes, all of these are only meaningful if they continue functioning across repeated exposure cycles. Not once, not twice, over and over. Because on the moon, you are not merely landing equipment, you are sentencing it to a long argument with temperature, and that argument gets even worse when the night begins. The lunar night is one of those facts that sounds manageable until you really let it expand in your mind. On Earth, night is ordinary because it is short. It passes. Even in difficult climates, sunrise comes back quickly enough that systems designed around the day-night rhythm can recover. But on the moon, night is not a pause. It is a regime. It stretches for roughly 2 weeks. 2 weeks without sunlight. 2 weeks in which any system dependent on solar input has to survive not just darkness, but the cold that darkness brings with it. That changes everything. A solar panel on Earth lives in a world where dawn is never far away. A solar-powered system on the moon must either store enough energy to cross an enormous interval of no generation at all, or depend on an entirely different power architecture capable of sustaining life support, heating, communications, computation, mobility, and emergency margin through a prolonged period of hostile cold. For robotic systems, failure to wake after lunar night has already been a real lesson. For human systems, failure is not a technical disappointment. It is a survival event, because a human habitat cannot hibernate in the way a small machine can. People require continuous environmental control, air circulation, pressure maintenance, thermal regulation, water processing, food systems, medical capability, lighting, communications. Every one of those depends on uninterrupted energy and on materials that continue functioning despite extended cold stress. So the lunar night is never just a lighting problem. It is an energy problem, a heating problem, a structural problem, and a recovery problem all at once. A system must not only endure the cold, it must emerge from it still reliable. And while all of this is happening, something else is still reaching the surface. Micrometeorites. This is another hazard that public imagination tends to misread because the word sounds small. It suggests dust-like particles, tiny impacts, something too minor to matter, unless luck goes terribly wrong. But speed changes the meaning of size. On Earth, the atmosphere burns most small incoming particles away before we ever have to think about them. The planet quietly handles the problem for us. On the moon, that protection does not exist. Tiny particles strike the surface at extraordinary velocities, carrying enough kinetic energy to pit, chip, scar, and gradually compromise exposed materials over time. Again, the moon's genius for hostility is patience. A single micrometeorite may not destroy a habitat module. A short mission may never experience the worst-case impact in any obvious way. But long-duration infrastructure does not live in the logic of one event. It lives in the logic of accumulation. Coatings are degraded. Transparent surfaces become more vulnerable. Solar panels lose efficiency. External layers take small hits that are individually survivable and collectively corrosive. This is erosion without wind, weathering without water, damage without drama. The moon keeps rearranging the integrity of the things we place there, one tiny strike at a time. And that is the broader truth connecting all three of these forces. Heat, darkness, and impact. None of them need to be theatrical to be dangerous. They do not have to announce a crisis in order to create one. They only have to keep operating longer than the systems we depend on can resist them. That is why long-term habitation is such a fundamentally different question from landing and leaving. A short visit can survive inside temporary margins. A permanent presence has to maintain those margins continuously, while the environment works against them every hour, through every cycle, across every exposed surface. That is the difference between mission success and environmental compatibility. The moon may allow you to arrive with well-built hardware. That does not mean it will allow that hardware to remain trustworthy over time. It means every pressure vessel, Every connector, every joint, every thermal layer, every external panel, every mobility system, every exposed instrument is placed into a slow contest against a world that never stops testing material limits. Heat stretches them, cold tightens them, night starves them, impacts mark them, and none of those processes are isolated from one another. They overlap. A surface already weakened by thermal stress is more vulnerable to impact damage. A system already power limited by prolonged darkness has less margin to recover from degradation. Reliability becomes less a property and more a struggle. So when people talk about building on the moon, the real question is not whether we can place structures there. Of course we can place them there. The question is whether those structures can remain themselves, whether a habitat can stay sealed, whether a rover can keep moving, whether a power system can keep producing, whether a mechanism can keep aligning, a panel can keep collecting, a thermal barrier can keep insulating, a window can keep seeing, a machine can keep being the machine it was designed to be after the moon has spent enough time acting on it. Because this is one of the deepest truths the lunar environment forces us to confront. Survival is not only about protecting the human body from the outside, it is about protecting every human-made system from becoming slowly less trustworthy in a place where repair is difficult, replacement is expensive, and failure does not remain localized for long. And if the moon can already wear down machines with this much patience, then the next fracture in the old story runs even deeper. Because beneath the surface we once imagined as dead and still, the ground itself is not as stable as we wanted to believe. For a very long time, the moon benefited from a kind of reputational simplicity. It looked still. It looked finished. It looked like the most complete example of a dead world we had ever seen. No weather, no oceans, no atmosphere, no shifting cloud systems, no forests, no rivers, no visible erosion, no biological activity of any kind, just a silent surface holding its shape beneath a black sky. And once that image settled into public imagination, it quietly shaped something deeper than aesthetics. It shaped assumption. If the moon was dead, then the ground could be trusted. That assumption ran deeper than most people realized. It sat beneath the entire emotional architecture of lunar return. The environment might be harsh, yes. The dust might be abrasive. The radiation might be severe. The temperatures might be extreme. But at least the foundation itself, the surface below the habitat, the landing pad, the rover path, the storage platform, the extraction machinery, would be stable. The moon might be hostile above the ground, but surely the ground itself was inert. Apollo was one of the first reasons that assumption began to crack. When the astronauts placed seismometers on the lunar surface, they were not expecting to discover a world that behaved like an active system. The moon was supposed to be quiet in the geological sense, cold, rigid, ancient, and essentially done. But the instruments did not return a picture of total stillness. They recorded motion, not once, not as an anomaly, but repeatedly. Over time, the Apollo seismic network detected thousands of seismic events. The message was subtle, but it was unmistakable. The moon was not silent below the surface. That did not mean it was Earth-like. It did not mean moving plates, erupting volcanoes, or continents grinding against one another. The moon is not geologically alive in the way our planet is alive, but that almost makes the discovery more unsettling, not less. Because it meant the moon occupied a stranger category, not dynamic enough to feel familiar, yet not inert enough to feel dependable. A world, still holding tension, still releasing stress, still responding to forces we once assumed had long since faded into geological memory. And then came the part that changed the emotional texture of the problem. Moonquakes do not behave like earthquakes. On Earth, when the ground moves, the violence is often intense but brief. Seismic energy is absorbed, dispersed, damped by a planet with water, fractured rock, molten zones, and a more complex internal system for bleeding motion away. The shaking arrives, peaks, and falls off. But the moon is dry, rigid, and structurally different. It does not dissipate energy with the same efficiency. When seismic waves move through the lunar crust, they can reverberate, they can persist. They can continue ringing through the body of the moon in a way that led scientists to use a phrase that sounds almost poetic until you think about what it implies. The moon rings like a bell. That is not the kind of metaphor engineers find comforting, because a structure designed for a short terrestrial jolt may behave very differently under prolonged vibration. A brief shock tests one kind of resilience. Sustained low-level oscillation tests another. Connections loosen. Stress redistributes. Small imperfections become active weaknesses. Components already under strain from thermal cycling are asked to hold alignment while the ground continues, moving beneath them longer than intuition expects. The problem is not simply whether a lunar habitat can survive a seismic event. It is whether it can survive repeated, poorly characterized seismic events while already being worn down by every other process the environment is running at the same time. That is where the old image of a dead world finally collapses. Because once the moon stops being a static stage, it becomes something harder to simplify. Not a backdrop for human activity, but a participant in it. Not a passive platform, but a body still changing under the weight of its own history, cooling, contracting, adjusting, holding old stresses in ancient rock and releasing them on timescales that do not care whether humans happen to be building there or not. And this is where the story begins to turn toward the South Pole. Because the South Pole is where all of the moon's contradictions start to pile on top of one another. For years, the logic of going there seemed beautifully straightforward. If humanity wants to do more than briefly visit the moon, it needs water, not as a luxury, but as the foundation of everything that makes persistence possible. Water for life support, water for oxygen, water for fuel. Water as the difference between a place you can land on and a place you can build from. And the most promising concentrations of lunar ice are not scattered conveniently across the surface. They are concentrated in the polar regions, especially near permanently shadowed craters, where sunlight never reaches and volatile compounds can remain trapped for immense spans of time. That is why the South Pole became more than a destination. It became the location around which long-term strategy hardened into something real. But the closer our science looked, the less simple the ground beneath that strategy began to appear. Recent observations have pointed towards structural features in the South Polar region that complicate the comforting old picture of total geological stillness. Fault-related landforms, scarps, signs that the crust in some of these areas has not merely preserved ancient fractures, but may still reflect relatively recent tectonic adjustment, not violent in the cinematic sense. Not a warning that the region is constantly breaking apart, but enough to force a harder question. What if the exact terrain we need most is less stable than we told ourselves it was? That is the real discomfort of the South Pole problem. The permanently shadowed regions preserve the ice, but they do so inside a landscape shaped by extremes: darkness, brutal cold, difficult topography, and now the possibility that subtle structural instability is part of the same package. The resource and the risk are not separated by geography. They coexist. The same terrain that makes long-term human survival plausible also makes long-term engineering confidence harder to earn. And that tension is not abstract. It has direct implications for what kind of future we are actually imagining. A short mission can tolerate a certain degree of uncertainty in the ground below it. A temporary landing site can accept some unknowns, especially if duration is limited and infrastructure is light. But a long-term outpost is a different category of commitment. Habitats, landing pads, storage units, power systems, rovers, ice extraction equipment, processing facilities, surface routes. All of it assumes something quietly foundational, that the ground can be characterized well enough to build on, trust over time, and return to repeatedly without discovering too late that the environment is still more active than our models anticipated. And even a moderate level of seismic uncertainty becomes more serious when it is layered into everything else we have already named. A structure at the lunar South Pole will not exist in a pristine engineering state. It will already be under thermal stress. Materials will already be expanding and contracting through severe cycles. Dust will already be infiltrating systems and wearing down interfaces. Radiation will already be degrading hardware and constraining operational flexibility. Power systems will already be living inside the brutal arithmetic of darkness and cold. Now place all of that on terrain that may not be catastrophically unstable, but is not as unquestionably still as once assumed. The issue is no longer whether any single factor is survivable by itself. The issue is what happens when several survivable stresses begin reinforcing one another. That is how environments become more dangerous than their individual hazards suggest. Not through one decisive event, but through interaction. A seal already weakened by abrasion behaves differently under vibration. A structure already fatigued by thermal cycling responds differently to repeated ground motion. A precision system operating in darkness and cold has less margin for misalignment, less resilience against movement, less tolerance for the kind of subtle instability that might have seemed trivial in a cleaner environment. The moon does not need its hazards to be individually catastrophic. It only needs them to overlap, and the South Pole may be the clearest example of that principle in the entire lunar story. It is the place we must go if we want the moon to become more than a symbolic return. It is also the place where the fantasy of a quiet, waiting world becomes hardest to sustain. Because the South Pole is not merely remote, it is strategically unavoidable and environmentally layered. It contains the resource that makes habitation conceivable, wrapped inside the very conditions that make habitation harder to secure. This is why the old phrase, "dead world," is no longer useful. It hides too much. It suggests the absence of threat when the reality is the presence of slow, accumulated instability. The moon may not be alive, but it is not finished. It is still cooling, still contracting, still carrying internal stress into surface expression, still capable of reminding us that a world does not have to be dramatic to remain active. And if we are serious about living there, then we cannot build our future on the emotional convenience of old assumptions. We have to build on the truth instead. The truth is that the moon is not simply hostile above the surface. It may also be less dependable below the surface than the mythology of Apollo-era stillness ever allowed us to believe. And the closer we move toward the South Pole, the more that matters, because the dream of permanence is no longer resting on a generic lunar plane. It is resting on the one region where survival may be possible and certainty may be hardest to achieve. Which means the next problem is not just whether the ground can hold our machines. It is whether the one resource that makes long-term survival possible is trapped inside a geography that turns every solution into a deeper trade-off. If there is one place on the moon where the future of human presence rises and collapses at the same time, it is the South Pole. That is what makes it so important and so uncomfortable, because in strategic terms, the logic seems almost unavoidable. If humanity wants to do more than visit the moon briefly, if the goal is not another symbolic landing but a sustained presence, then survival has to become local. You cannot build a real long-duration system by launching every critical resource from Earth forever. The mass becomes punishing, the cost becomes unstable, the architecture becomes fragile. Every mission depends on a supply chain stretched across hundreds of thousands of kilometers, and every kilogram that must be launched from Earth keeps the moon in the category of temporary ambition rather than lasting foothold. That is why water changes everything. Water is not just a consumable. It is not simply something astronauts drink to stay alive. On the moon, water becomes infrastructure. It becomes oxygen for breathing. It becomes part of life support. And when split into hydrogen and oxygen, it becomes fuel. That single fact transforms the moon from a destination into a platform. If usable ice exists in meaningful quantities, then the moon is no longer only a place you go to. It becomes a place you can begin operating from, a place that can, at least in theory, participate in supporting its own continued use. Without that possibility, long-term habitation remains trapped inside a permanent dependency model. With it, an entirely different future becomes imaginable. And that is precisely why the South Pole matters so much. The most promising concentrations of water ice are believed to exist in the permanently shadowed regions near the lunar poles, places where the geometry of sunlight and terrain creates pockets of near-eternal darkness. These are not ordinary cold zones. They are among the most extreme thermal environments in the inner solar system. Sunlight does not reach them directly. Temperatures remain so low that volatile compounds delivered over immense spans of time can remain preserved there, locked in the dark, waiting not as a gift, but as a challenge. The South Pole is valuable because it may hold the one resource that turns lunar survival from a costly stunt into something more durable. But that value comes wrapped inside the harshest operating conditions the moon has to offer. This is the paradox. The place that makes long-term presence possible is also the place that makes long-term presence hardest to execute. Because the ice is not lying out in a clean, sunlit plain waiting to be collected, it is hidden in terrain defined by darkness, steep geometry, difficult navigation, savage cold, and severe engineering constraints. These are craters where sunlight never arrives, where conventional solar logic begins to fail, where every step of extraction, transport, and processing becomes more complicated than the clean diagrams suggest. It is one thing to say the moon has resources. It is another thing entirely to operate inside the exact kind of environment that preserves them. Darkness alone changes the entire emotional structure of the problem. On Earth, even the harshest environments still usually offer some relationship to light, some visual rhythm that helps machinery, navigation, and human perception stay anchored. The permanently shadowed regions do not. They are not merely dim, they are operationally hostile in a more absolute sense. Every movement must be mediated by instruments, artificial illumination, remote sensing, and systems that themselves must remain functional in extreme cold. Every meter of terrain becomes more expensive to understand. Every surface operation becomes more dependent on precision. And precision, on the moon, is always being attacked by dust, temperature, fatigue, and delay. Then there is the cold. Not ordinary cold. Not even the cold of polar Earth. A level of thermal severity that changes the behavior of materials themselves. Metals become more brittle. Lubricants become harder to rely on. Electronics face a much narrower survival margin. Mechanical systems that might feel robust in a laboratory or even in deep terrestrial winter become far less trustworthy when exposed to prolonged darkness at temperatures that push hardware toward its limits. The South Pole does not merely ask whether a machine can function, it asks whether that machine can keep being itself in a place where matter is constantly being pushed toward failure. And even that is not the end of the problem. Because the terrain is difficult in a way that strategy presentations often flatten into abstraction, permanently shadowed regions are not neat storage vaults. They are rugged, uneven, partially understood landscapes, deep craters, hard-to-map slopes, complex surface geometry. Places where line-of-sight communication can be constrained, mobility becomes more fragile, and recovery from error is more difficult. A system designed to operate there has to do more than work in principle. It has to work under compounded uncertainty, where visibility, power, temperature, and terrain all degrade margin at once. That alone would make the South Pole one of the hardest places on the moon to build around. But the deeper discomfort is that the region may not even offer the full geological confidence we once hoped it did. This is what turns difficulty into paradox. The same region that may preserve the ice humanity needs may also include structural complexity and fault-related features that make the old fantasy of a perfectly stable foundation harder to defend. Not because the South Pole is constantly erupting into catastrophe, not because the science says the area is unusable, but because the closer we look, the less the ground behaves like the emotionally convenient image of a dead, settled world. There are reasons to think the crust in parts of this strategically critical region may still be carrying the signatures of relatively recent movement and internal stress. So the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. We need the South Pole because the ice is there. We fear the South Pole because everything else difficult is there too. Darkness is there. Extreme cold is there. Operational fragility is there. Terrain complexity is there. Possible structural instability is there. The resource and the hazard are not two separate problems waiting in different places. They are the same place. The same mission architecture that points us toward survival also points us toward compounded risk. And that has enormous consequences for how we should think about the future. It means long-term lunar presence will not be built by choosing the safest place and then importing convenience from elsewhere. It will be built, if it is built at all, by confronting the fact that the essential resource is embedded inside one of the least forgiving geographies available. The South Pole is not attractive because it is easy. It is attractive because there is no equally viable alternative. That is what gives it strategic power and existential pressure at the same time. In a strange way, this reveals something fundamental about the moon itself. The moon does not place the things we need in places that welcome us. It locks them inside extremes. It turns usefulness into effort. It links survival to environments that test every system required to claim it. The South Pole is the clearest expression of that design. It is where long-term hope becomes technically real. It is also where the moon seems most determined to remind us that hope alone is not an engineering solution. So when people talk about the South Pole as the future of lunar habitation, that is true. But it is only half the truth. The fuller truth is that the South Pole is where survival and hazard become inseparable. It is where the entire vision of living on the moon narrows to one unavoidable proposition. The resource that could let us stay is trapped inside the very environment most likely to break the systems that must reach it. And once that becomes clear, the next question grows even more serious. Because even if we solve the terrain, the darkness, the cold, the extraction problem, and the structural uncertainty, we are still left with one unknown that no crater map can answer. What the moon does, not just to our machines, but to the human body that must keep operating among them. For all the danger the moon presents from the outside, there is another uncertainty that may be even more profound, because it does not begin in the environment around the astronaut. It begins inside the astronaut. Up to this point, the question has mostly been about exposure, dust in the lungs, radiation in tissue, cold against materials, darkness against systems, seismic stress beneath foundations. These are the external pressures, the things the moon does to whatever enters its domain. But long-duration presence depends on something even more fragile than hardware. It depends on whether the human body itself can remain functionally human in a gravity field it has never experienced for long enough to understand. That is the blind spot at the center of the entire dream. We know what Earth gravity does, because it built us. Every bone in the body, every muscle group, the cardiovascular system, the balance system, the distribution of fluids, the ordinary mechanics of standing, walking, lifting, recovering, sleeping, healing, all of it evolved under one constant force. We also know a great deal now about what happens when that force is almost entirely removed. Decades of research in orbit have shown that the human body begins adapting to microgravity almost immediately. Bone density declines, muscles weaken, fluids shift upward, the heart deconditions, balance changes, vision can be affected, immune function becomes more complicated. Even when astronauts exercise aggressively, some degree of physiological drift still occurs. That knowledge is important, but it creates a dangerous illusion of completeness, because the moon is not microgravity, and it is not Earth. It sits in between, and that middle category is exactly where our certainty disappears. Lunar gravity is about 1/6 of what we live under here. That means the body is not freed from gravity, but it is not truly supported by it either. There is still up and down. There is still weight. You can stand, you can walk, you can jump and land. At first glance, that sounds reassuring. It sounds like enough force to keep the body organized, enough resistance to preserve strength, enough structure to prevent the worst of what happens in orbit. But that word, enough, is doing enormous work. Because biology does not respond to hope. It responds to thresholds. Bones are maintained by load. Muscles are maintained by resistance. The cardiovascular system is maintained by the continual demand of moving blood through a body that exists inside gravity. Remove too much of that demand, and the body begins treating parts of itself as overbuilt. It trims what it no longer feels required to maintain. That is not failure. It is adaptation. The body is efficient. It responds to the world it is given, not the world we wish it were in. So the real question is not whether 1/6 gravity has an effect. Of course it does. The real question is whether 1/6 gravity crosses the threshold required to preserve long-term human stability. And the honest answer is that we do not know. Not approximately, not with confidence, not in the way a civilization preparing to build on another world would ideally want to know. There is no human population that has lived for months or years in lunar gravity. There is no dataset showing what happens to bone remodeling across long-duration lunar exposure. No complete record of how muscle groups adapt when the body is partially loaded but not fully challenged. No definitive answer about whether cardiovascular deconditioning slows to a safe plateau or continues in a quieter but still dangerous direction. No full understanding of whether partial gravity preserves recovery capacity, wound healing, immune balance, and physical resilience well enough for repeated missions to remain sustainable. That absence matters because partial gravity is not simply a watered-down version of weightlessness. It may be its own category of stress. The body might stabilize, it might not. Bone loss might slow enough to be manageable, or it might continue, gradually, below the level of daily notice, until the consequences become operationally serious. Muscles might retain enough strength for short surface activity, while still degrading in ways that reduce endurance, coordination, recovery, or resistance to injury over longer spans. The heart might remain better conditioned than it does in orbit, while still becoming less capable than a long-term lunar worker would need. And because all of these systems interact, a small decline in one can quietly amplify a larger decline in another. That is what makes this different from an abstract medical question. It is not about biology in isolation. It is about mission architecture. A body that is slowly weakening in 1/6 gravity is not just a patient. It is also the operator of the rover, the maintainer of the habitat, the responder during an emergency, the person who has to move under pressure, think clearly under fatigue, and function in a place where rescue is slow and margin is thin. Human physiology on the moon is not background science. It is part of the machine of survival itself, and that machine may be changing even while it appears to be working. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of the lunar gravity problem. Many physiological drifts do not announce themselves immediately. They accumulate. A crew member can still be functional while becoming less robust, still capable while becoming less recoverable, still performing while trending slowly away from the biological baseline that made sustained performance possible in the first place. And because the moon would add this gravitational uncertainty on top of radiation, dust exposure, thermal stress, confinement, disrupted circadian cues, and psychological strain, the body would not be adapting to one variable at a time. It would be adapting to a combined stress environment unlike anything any human being has ever inhabited continuously before. That changes how every other hazard must be interpreted. Radiation matters more if tissue repair is altered. Dust matters more if immune regulation is strained. Injury matters more if bone strength is drifting downward. Fatigue matters more if muscle endurance is reduced. Isolation matters more if sleep quality, hormonal balance, and stress tolerance are being shaped by a body that no longer behaves exactly the way it does on Earth. The moon does not just add danger around the human body, it may change the body's ability to absorb danger at all. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part is how little Apollo can tell us about this. Apollo astronauts did not stay long enough for the deeper physiological question to emerge. Days are not enough. A brief visit can pass through an environment before the slowest systems have time to reveal how they are changing. That means Apollo gave us many things, but not this answer. It proved we could function there temporarily. It did not prove that human physiology could settle there without cost. Artemis, or whatever long-duration missions follow, would not simply be extending an established biological model. They would be creating one in real time. That means the first people who remain on the moon for extended periods will be doing something humanity has never done before, in a very literal sense. They will not just be exploring a place. They will be generating the first lived data on what partial gravity actually does to a human being over meaningful time. That is both historic and unnerving. Because we often talk about long-term lunar habitation as if the engineering challenge were the hardest part. As if once habitats are sealed and power systems function and dust is managed and radiation is reduced, the human being inside the structure can be treated as a mostly solved variable. But the truth may be the opposite. The most important unknown is not only whether the machines can survive the moon, it is whether the organism operating those machines can remain stable enough to justify building a life around them. This is where the emotional center of the story shifts again. The moon is no longer just a world trying to break our hardware. It becomes a place asking a deeper, quieter question of our biology. Not can you visit, not can you endure a short passage, but can your body inhabit an in-between gravity without slowly becoming something less capable than the mission requires? That is a much harder question than it sounds. Because we know humans can survive too little gravity for a while. We know humans can thrive in full gravity. What we do not know is what happens in the long middle. What happens when the body is not released from gravity, but underfed by it? When it receives enough force to keep going, but perhaps not enough to remain whole. When adaptation continues, but never fully settles. When the body is no longer in crisis, but is no longer entirely at home in its own mechanics either. That is the real biological unknown of the moon. And once you see it clearly, long-term habitation begins to look less like a simple expansion of human reach, and more like a controlled experiment with the most fundamental system we possess. Not a drill, not a simulation, a real test, with real bodies, in a place where the answer cannot be learned safely in advance. Which means the next danger is not just whether one system changes. It is what happens when many systems begin changing at the same time, slowly, quietly, and in combination, until the body itself starts drifting away from the version of human physiology that life on Earth has always sustained. This is the point where the moon stops feeling like a list of hazards and starts feeling like a system. Up to now, it is possible to keep each danger in its own mental box. Dust is one problem, radiation is another, reduced gravity is another. Thermal stress, isolation, sleep disruption, medical limitation, equipment wear, all of them can be described separately, studied separately, assigned to separate teams, separate reports, separate mitigation strategies. And that is useful, up to a point. Engineering requires categories. Medicine requires categories. Mission planning requires categories. But the human body does not experience the moon in categories. It experiences the moon as overlap. That is the deeper problem. Not simply that the environment contains many risks, but that those risks do not arrive one at a time, waiting politely for the previous one to finish. They layer, they reinforce, they alter the meaning of one another. A stress that might be manageable in isolation becomes more dangerous when it lands on a system already adapting somewhere else. The moon is not a sequence of challenges. It is a pressure field, and the body inside that field may not fail dramatically at first. It may drift. That word matters. Drift suggests something slow enough to miss if you only look for crisis. Something gradual, cumulative, easy to normalize while it is happening. A body can still perform while drifting. It can still complete tasks, answer questions, run procedures, move through routines, appear operationally sound. But beneath that outward functionality, multiple systems may already be shifting away from the baseline that made that functionality robust in the first place. And once several of those shifts are happening together, the danger is no longer any one change by itself. The danger is the combined effect of many small departures from normal human equilibrium. Take bone and muscle first, because they are the easiest to picture. If 1/6 gravity is not sufficient to fully preserve load-bearing structure, then the body may begin reducing bone density and muscle capacity over time, perhaps more slowly than in microgravity, but slower is not the same as harmless. A gradual reduction in strength does not merely affect lifting or walking, it affects balance, recovery, endurance, resistance to injury, and the body's ability to respond under sudden strain. A person who is slightly weaker is not simply a person who can lift less. On the moon, that person may also be less stable in a suit, slower during emergency movement, more vulnerable during a fall, less able to compensate when another system goes wrong. Now, add radiation to that. Radiation is not just a long-term cancer statistic floating somewhere in the future. It acts in the present at the level of tissue, stress, cellular damage, repair burden, immune strain. If the body is already adapting to reduced gravity, already trimming load-bearing systems, already shifting fluid dynamics and cardiovascular behavior, then radiation is not landing on a stable biological platform. It is landing on one already in transition. Damage that might be repaired efficiently on Earth may be handled differently in a body already under systemic adaptation. Tissue resilience is not an abstract property. It depends on the condition of the whole organism. Then add dust. Dust matters more when the body is less able to respond cleanly to irritation and inflammation. If lunar particles reach the lungs, the problem is not merely their sharpness. It is what happens after that contact. What kind of inflammatory response is triggered, how effectively the body clears or contains the material, whether repair is clean or incomplete, whether immune function is stable enough to manage the burden without turning low-level exposure into chronic stress. Again, the hazards are no longer separate. A respiratory irritant in a body also coping with radiation exposure and altered immune behavior is not the same threat it would be in isolation. That is how compounding works. One factor does not replace another. It changes its context. And once context changes, the whole survival equation changes with it. This becomes even more serious when you remember that the moon is not asking the body to adapt in a hospital or a controlled laboratory or a place where care can escalate quickly. It is asking the body to adapt in an operational environment where performance must continue while adaptation is still unfolding. The crew member is not resting under observation. The crew member is maintaining equipment, monitoring systems, running EVAs, making decisions, responding to delays, living in confinement, sleeping on schedules designed by necessity rather than comfort, and carrying the cognitive load of a place where small mistakes can grow teeth very quickly. So, physiological drift does not remain physiological for long. It becomes operational. A slightly weaker musculoskeletal system can become a slower response time. A slightly altered cardiovascular state can become faster fatigue. A slightly strained immune system can turn a minor irritation into a mission-complicating condition. A slightly degraded sleep pattern can become poorer judgment. A slightly elevated stress baseline can become thinner patience, weaker concentration, worse communication. Each shift may look modest when measured alone, but the moon does not care about them alone. It cares about how they behave when stacked inside one person, in one habitat, on one difficult day. That is the part ordinary conversations about spaceflight often miss. They imagine risk as punctual, a failure, an accident, a single event, with a timestamp. But some of the most serious risks in lunar habitation may not have clean timestamps at all. They may emerge as the body gradually becoming less forgiving, less buffered, less able to absorb error, less able to recover from strain, less able to stay centered under the overlapping demands of the environment. Not broken, but less resilient. Not incapacitated, but less recoverable. Not in crisis, but moving closer to it without any one dramatic moment announcing that the line has been crossed. This is why the moon may challenge not just survival, but biological coherence. On Earth, the body is supported by a deep background of environmental stability. One gravity, air, pressure, familiar light cycles, rapid access to care, constant ecological cues. Even when a person is stressed, the world around them is still broadly compatible with the structure of human life. On the moon, that support architecture is gone. The body is not being held inside its native conditions while solving a temporary problem. It is being asked to remain integrated inside an environment that is subtly misaligned with nearly every system it relies on. So the central fear is not simply damage, it is divergence. The possibility that over time, the body on the moon becomes a system under continuous adaptation without a true resting state, always compensating, always adjusting, never fully collapsing, but never fully settling either. That kind of drift is hard to dramatize, but it may be the most important form of danger in the entire lunar story. Because dramatic danger gets attention, drift gets normalized, and normalization can be lethal. A crew can get used to fatigue, used to irritation, used to reduced capacity, used to small impairments that, in a less demanding environment, might be inconvenient but manageable. But on the moon, manageability is not a generous category. It has very little slack in it. If enough small degradations begin lining up in the same direction, then what looked acceptable on paper can become fragile in practice. A mission does not need a catastrophic biological collapse to become unsafe. It only needs the accumulated performance margin of the crew to fall below the complexity of the environment. That is the true significance of compounding stress. It turns the moon from a hostile place into a hostile system, not because any one variable is unbeatable, but because the body must absorb many variables at once, and because those variables do not simply add together, they interact, they distort one another, they deepen one another, they create a kind of total pressure that no human being has ever lived inside for long enough to fully understand. And until that understanding exists, every long-duration lunar mission will carry a hidden uncertainty at its center. Not just whether the body can survive, whether the body can remain sufficiently itself. Because if the moon slowly turns human biology into a drifting system, then the question is no longer only about endurance. It becomes a question of identity at the physiological level. How much adaptation can occur before a crew is still alive, still functioning, and yet no longer operating with the stability the mission assumed would be there? That is the threshold we do not yet know. And if the body itself may become less anchored over time, then the final layer of the problem is not physical in the narrow sense at all. It is what happens to perception, emotion, cognition, and the human need for psychological continuity in a place that strips away almost every familiar signal of home. There is one more way the moon resists human presence, and it may be the hardest one to measure clearly because it does not begin with broken hardware or damaged tissue. It begins with perception. A person can prepare for danger that feels mechanical. Pressure loss, radiation exposure, equipment failure. Those threats are terrifying, but they are also legible. They belong to the language of engineering. They can be modeled, monitored, rehearsed, reduced to procedures and response windows. Psychological isolation is different. It does not strike like a clean event. It alters the meaning of the environment itself. It changes how reality is felt, how time is experienced, how concentration is maintained, how emotion circulates inside a confined human group, how the mind interprets a world that no longer provides the ordinary signals it evolved to trust. That is why the psychological environment of the moon is not a secondary issue. It is part of the survival environment, because the moon does not merely remove comfort, it removes familiarity at a very deep level. On Earth, even harsh places still contain layers of sensory reassurance. Wind moves through them, light shifts across them, weather changes their mood, sound travels through air. The horizon breathes with distance, haze, moisture, motion, life. Even in an isolated desert or polar station, the mind is still surrounded by a planet. It still receives countless signals, subtle but constant, that the world is active, inhabited, and ecologically continuous. The moon removes almost all of that. Outside, the sky is not blue, grey, or dim. It is black in an absolute sense. Not because it is night, but because there is no atmosphere to soften light into anything familiar. The sun can be shining with full intensity, and the sky still remains black. Shadows are hard-edged. Brightness has no mercy in it. The landscape does not fade into atmosphere. It ends in starkness. There is no weather, no cloud cover, no moving air, no visible life, no changing ecological texture. Nothing rustles. Nothing flows. Nothing suggests that the environment is participating with you in any mutual sense. It simply remains there, inert and exposed, while you move through it as a sealed exception. And then there is the silence. Not quiet. Silence. On Earth, even what we call silence is full of structure. Distant wind, water, insects, leaves, tiny environmental noises that tell the nervous system it is embedded in a living world. On the moon, vacuum strips that away completely. Outside the habitat, there is no natural soundscape at all. No medium carries sound between body and landscape. The world becomes visually present and acoustically absent at the same time. That is not just unusual. It is psychologically alien. A place that can be seen but not heard in any ordinary way does not settle into the mind easily. It resists being experienced as normal. Inside the habitat, sound returns, but only as machinery, fans, pumps, air systems, electronics, mechanical hum, functional noise, not organic noise. Every sound is there because some system is working to prevent the environment outside from reaching you. That changes the emotional meaning of shelter. A room on Earth feels enclosed, but still continuous with the world beyond it. A habitat on the moon feels maintained against the world beyond it. Protected, yes, but never casually. Every tone in the background is a reminder that safety is being actively manufactured. That kind of setting changes cognition over time, because the human mind does not only depend on food, oxygen, and sleep. It depends on reference points, rhythms, sensory patterns, variation, a sense of continuity with something larger than the immediate room. Remove enough of those, and the mind does not simply remain itself inside a neutral box. It begins adapting just as the body does. Attention shifts, emotional tone shifts, tolerance changes. The ordinary friction of group life becomes harder to metabolize. Small irritations can become heavy. Time can become strangely flat. Days can stop feeling distinct from one another. A routine designed to preserve order can start to feel less like structure and more like enclosure. This is why analog environments on Earth, especially isolated research stations, have always mattered so much to space psychology. They show us something important. Human beings can endure confinement, but endurance is not the same as psychological ease. Over time, isolation can erode concentration. Sleep can become less stable. Emotional responses can flatten or intensify unpredictably. Social dynamics can become more brittle. People may withdraw, overfocus, become more irritable, or simply lose some of the elasticity that ordinary environments constantly help restore. And yet even the best Earth analogues still understate the moon. A remote Antarctic station is extreme, but the people inside it are still on Earth. They can step outside into air. They can see weather. They can hear the environment. They remain inside a living planetary system that the mind recognizes however harsh it may be. The moon offers a deeper kind of separation. It does not just isolate people from society. It isolates them from Earth-like perception itself. The environment outside the habitat is not merely empty of people. It is empty of almost every familiar signal the human nervous system has used for millennia to orient itself emotionally and cognitively. That matters because psychological stress is not separate from operational performance. A slightly more fatigued mind processes information differently. A slightly more strained crew communicates differently. A slightly more emotionally compressed environment changes how problems are framed, how conflict is handled, how ambiguity is tolerated, how mistakes are interpreted. In a forgiving setting, those shifts might be manageable. On the moon, where every task already exists inside material and biological pressure, the psychological layer becomes a multiplier. Poor sleep does not remain poor sleep. It becomes slower reaction time. Emotional friction does not remain emotional friction. It becomes weaker team coherence during difficult operations. Cognitive dulling does not remain a private struggle. It becomes part of the risk architecture of the mission. And then there is Earth itself, or more precisely, the changing psychological role of Earth. For astronauts on the near side, Earth can remain visible as a kind of emotional anchor, a constant visual reminder that home still exists somewhere beyond the sealed walls and procedural routines. But even that comfort is complicated. To see Earth constantly and remain unable to reach it, except through systems, schedules, and delay, is its own kind of psychological tension. It is presence without access, familiarity without immediacy, and for crews operating beyond direct sight, the severing becomes sharper. Home is no longer visible. Communication becomes more mediated. The difference between being far away and being perceptually disconnected begins to matter in a new way. This is the part that makes the moon more than a technical challenge. It makes it existential in a quieter sense. Because what long-duration lunar living may test is not only whether the human body can continue functioning there, but whether the human mind can continue feeling stably human there. Not in the sentimental sense, but in the practical one. Can meaning remain intact under monotony, danger, abstraction, and distance? Can perception remain sharp in a place stripped of natural reference? Can emotion remain regulated in an environment where privacy is limited, routine is necessary, and the outside world is not merely hostile but perceptually unreal in its stillness? These questions are not decorative. They go straight to mission endurance. A crew that loses psychological coherence does not need to collapse dramatically to become vulnerable. It only needs to become a little less attentive, a little less patient, a little less coordinated, a little less able to absorb ambiguity without strain. And because lunar operations would already be demanding under the best conditions, even small degradations in morale, clarity, or social trust can matter far more than they would in a normal terrestrial workplace. The moon compresses consequence. It makes interior life operational. That is why psychological isolation is not an afterthought. It is the final invisible layer in a world already full of invisible pressure. The moon does not simply challenge the body with dust, radiation, gravity, and cold. It challenges the mind by stripping away almost every environmental cue that ordinarily tells a human being where they are, what time means, what safety feels like, and how life normally sounds. It does not only ask whether you can stay alive there, it asks whether you can remain cognitively clear, emotionally steady, and socially intact while doing so. And once that is understood, the entire meaning of Artemis begins to sharpen, because what is being tested is no longer just propulsion, landing systems, habitats, or resource extraction. What is being tested is whether human beings can preserve enough physical and psychological continuity to function in a place that quietly pressures every layer of what they are, which means the final question is no longer hidden at all. It is simply this: what is Artemis really trying to prove? By the time Artemis leaves Earth, the most important question will no longer be whether we can reach the moon. That question is emotionally powerful, historically meaningful, and already partially answered. We know human beings can travel there. We know we can enter lunar orbit. We know we can land, work for a short time, and return. Apollo proved that the crossing itself, while extraordinary, is not the deepest unknown anymore. The deeper unknown begins after arrival. It begins when the mission stops being a journey and starts becoming a duration. That is what Artemis is really testing, not simply transportation. Endurance. And that distinction matters because endurance is a much harsher category than exploration. Exploration can tolerate a burst of effort, a short window of risk, a narrowly managed operation with a clear exit built into its structure. Endurance asks something more difficult. It asks whether systems can hold together after the first achievement is over, after the landing, after the celebration, after the symbolic moment has passed and the ordinary pressure of continued existence begins. That is where the moon becomes honest, because the moon does not care about milestone language. It does not care whether a mission is historic, elegant, or politically important. Once people and machines are there, the environment begins its work the same way every time. Dust enters, radiation accumulates, thermal cycles, stress materials, darkness tests, power architecture. The ground may shift more than expected. Biology adapts in uncertain directions. The mind has to keep functioning inside sensory and emotional conditions no human environment on Earth truly reproduces. Artemis is not just going to the moon. It is going into that entire system and asking a question no previous mission stayed long enough to answer properly. How long can human capability remain coherent there? That is the real experiment. Can a habitat remain sealed, functional, and trustworthy not for a moment, but over time? Can equipment stay aligned, clean enough, powered enough, and resilient enough, while the environment keeps acting on every exposed surface? Can operational routines continue without slowly degrading under the pressure of fatigue, maintenance burden, uncertainty, and cumulative exposure? Can a crew remain physically capable, psychologically stable, medically manageable, and socially coordinated in a place that keeps applying stress without relief? These are not side questions orbiting the main mission. They are the mission. That is why Artemis should be understood less as a return to familiar ground, and more as the first serious endurance experiment in lunar conditions. Not a laboratory experiment in the controlled sense, because the moon does not allow controlled simplification. It is an experiment in the older, riskier sense of the word. A direct encounter with reality. A test in which the variables cannot all be isolated beforehand, because the whole point is to discover what happens when they operate together. And that makes Artemis historically important in a different way than Apollo was. Apollo proved that human beings could arrive at another world and survive a short encounter with it. Artemis begins testing whether arrival can evolve into persistence, whether a visit can become a foothold, whether exposure can become routine without quietly becoming unmanageable. It is not trying to prove that we are brave enough to go. That part is almost the easiest thing to say. It is trying to prove something much less cinematic and much more consequential, that our engineering, our biology, our operational discipline, and our psychological resilience can all survive long enough in the same hostile environment to justify coming back again and again. In that sense, Artemis is not just a space program. It is a measurement program. A measurement of how much punishment lunar systems can absorb before trust begins to erode. A measurement of how much uncertainty human physiology can carry before adaptation turns into instability. A measurement of how much distance, isolation, and environmental indifference a crew can live inside before performance begins to drift. And perhaps most importantly, a measurement of whether all of those limits remain acceptable when layered together instead of studied one by one. That is why the outcome matters so much. Because if Artemis succeeds, the meaning of success will be larger than launch, orbit, landing, or even return. Success will mean that human systems can remain integrated on the moon for longer than we have ever demonstrated before. It will mean that the idea of living there has moved one step away from symbolism and one step closer to evidence. But if Artemis struggles, or if it reveals that the moon wears down bodies, hardware, schedules, and margins faster than expected, then that result is just as historically important. Not because it ends the dream, but because it finally clarifies the true scale of the problem. And clarity is what this mission is really for. Artemis is not only asking whether we can build pathways back to the moon, it is asking whether the moon will allow those pathways to remain open once human presence becomes sustained enough for the environment to reveal its full character. That is the redefinition that matters. Artemis is not a replay of Apollo with newer hardware and better cameras. It is the beginning of a long answer to a much harder question. Not can we touch the moon again? Can we keep functioning there long enough for the word presence to mean something real? And if that is the question Artemis is truly testing, then the final step is unavoidable. We have to bring everything back to the one line that has been forming underneath every part of this story from the beginning. Not whether the moon can be reached, whether it can ever become a home. So after all of this, after the dust, the radiation, the thermal violence, the long darkness, the micrometeorite erosion, the unstable ground, the buried ice, the unresolved biology, and the psychological weight of living in a place that strips away almost every familiar cue of home, the central question becomes impossible to avoid. Not can we go back? We can. Not can we land? We can. Not can we survive a brief visit with enough preparation, enough precision, and enough courage? History already tells us that we can do that too. The harder question, the one Artemis is really moving toward whether it says so publicly or not, is much quieter than that and much more serious. Can we stay? Can we remain there long enough for presence to become real rather than symbolic? Can we keep bodies, habitats, machines, schedules, judgment, and trust intact in an environment that does not attack through one dramatic weakness, but through constant pressure applied across everything at once? Can we build not just a mission profile, but a working human condition on a world where almost every background fact is hostile to the kind of life we are trying to extend into it? That is the question now. Because the moon is no longer just a destination in the old heroic sense. It is not simply a place waiting for another flag, another footprint, another generation to replay a familiar moment with better cameras and more sophisticated hardware. The moon has become something more demanding than that. It has become a test of continuity, a test of whether human systems can remain coherent in a place that quietly pressures every layer of what those systems depend on. And that is why this story should not end in triumphal language. Not yet. There is a temptation, especially after so many decades of absence, to frame Artemis as a simple restoration, as though history paused and is finally resuming where it left off. But the truth is harder and more interesting than that. We are not stepping back into an answered question. We are stepping forward into one that Apollo opened without resolving. The moon we are returning to is not the simplified moon of memory. It is the harsher moon revealed by 50 years of accumulated science, a surface that cuts, a sky that does not shield, a ground that may not be as still as we hoped, a gravity field that sits in the gap between what our bodies know and what they have never had to endure for long enough to understand. And that means Artemis is not the end of uncertainty. It is the beginning of honest uncertainty, the beginning of real evidence, real exposure, real duration, real data about what happens when human beings stop touching the moon briefly and start trying to exist there long enough for the environment to answer back. That answer may be encouraging. It may show that with the right architecture, enough discipline, enough shielding, enough adaptation, long-term presence is possible. Or it may show that the moon extracts a cost larger than our optimism has wanted to admit, that some environments do not become homes simply because we want them to, that some worlds can be reached, worked, studied, even used, without ever becoming truly compatible with the lives trying to root themselves there. We do not know yet which answer is waiting. That is the most important truth. After all the planning, all the engineering, all the simulations, all the mission architecture, all the political language about return, sustainability, and the future of human presence beyond Earth, the most honest sentence we can still say about long-term life on the moon is that it remains unproven, not impossible, not guaranteed, unproven. And there is something strangely clarifying in that, because it returns the moon to what it really is, not a trophy, not a nostalgic backdrop, not a symbol we already understand, but a reality. Indifferent, silent, physically exacting, and under no obligation to become easier just because we have come back with better tools. If the next era of lunar exploration succeeds, it will not be because the moon welcomed us. It will be because, for a while at least, human beings learned how to hold themselves together inside its indifference. That is a very different kind of victory. And it is also why the final image of this story should not be a celebration line about how we are back. It should be a question held open under all the silence. We have reached the moon before. We are about to reach it again. But reaching is not the same as remaining. And until the moon has tested our bodies, our machines, our patience, and our ability to keep a human world intact inside a place so fundamentally unlike our own, the only ending honest enough for this moment is the unfinished one. Not, we are back, but this, can we stay?